My name's Cassie, and this is the story of how my own family told me I wasn't good enough to attend my sister's wedding. The very people who were supposed to stand by me in every season of life turned their backs when I needed them most. It wasn't just some casual exclusion. It was a deep, personal betrayal that cut me open and left me bleeding in silence. Growing up in a middle-class American family, Sunday dinners, family road trips, and movie nights were the glue that held us together. Or so I thought. I always believed that no matter what happened in life, my family would be there, unconditionally. That blood was thicker than anything else. That loyalty wasn't earned, it was automatic. But sometimes, the people you trust the most can shatter your heart in a way no stranger ever could. My sister Emily had always been the shining star of the family, the one who followed the rules, got straight A's, volunteered on weekends, and brought home boys who wore boat shoes and said, "Sir," and "Ma'am." She was perfect in their eyes. Me? I was different. I asked questions that made people uncomfortable. I dyed my hair colors that made my mom sigh loudly across the dinner table. I got a tattoo when I turned 18. And when I dropped out of college to start my own business, it was like I'd committed a crime. They never said it outright, but I knew I wasn't what they wanted me to be. Still, I held on to hope that, deep down, they loved me for who I was. That illusion cracked slowly over the years, but it shattered completely when the wedding was announced. Emily was getting married to Tyler, a guy who looked like he'd been printed straight out of a country club catalog. My parents were thrilled. The preparations began months in advance. Dress fittings, cake tastings, bridal showers. And yet, I noticed something strange. I wasn't being included. At first, it was little things. I wasn't asked to help pick centerpieces. I wasn't invited to the bridal shower. No one even asked for my opinion on the music playlist, even though I was the only one in the family who actually worked in event planning. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was overthinking, but deep down, a knot was forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. And then came the phone call. It was a Thursday evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the skyline. I was sitting on my couch, wearing old sweatpants, trying to unwind after a long day, when my phone buzzed. It was Mom. Her voice was tight, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. "Cassie, your father and I have talked, and we think it might be best if you didn't come to the wedding." My heart stopped. I blinked, thinking I'd misheard. "What?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then continued, "It's just, with everything going on, your sister is worried that your presence might cause drama. You know how you can be. We just don't want anything to ruin her big day." And that was it. No room for discussion, no consideration for my feelings. Just a cold dismissal, like I was a variable they needed to eliminate from their perfect equation. I hung up the phone and just stared at the wall, numb. The silence in my apartment was deafening. My hands were shaking, heart pounding so hard, it echoed in my ears. I wasn't invited, not because I couldn't make it, not because there weren't enough seats, but because they didn't want me there, because they believed I would ruin it, as if my presence alone was poisonous. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, again and again. I spent the next few hours pacing, crying, screaming into pillows, calling my best friend and sobbing into the phone. How could they do this to me? I kept asking. What did I ever do to deserve this? She didn't have answers. No one did. I started replaying every memory I had with my family. Holidays, birthdays, camping trips. Were those moments ever real? Or had I always just been an outsider tagging along? The The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many times I'd been overlooked, ignored, pushed to the sidelines. I was the sister who wasn't trusted, the daughter who was always a disappointment. I remembered one Christmas when I had spent days making handmade gifts for everyone. Customized, thoughtful, personal, and Emily gave them all gift cards. Guess who got praised? Not me. That was always the story. She could do no wrong. I could do no right. I started to feel this cold, creeping sense of clarity wash over me. This wasn't new. This had been building for years. The wedding was just the final straw. The one moment where they stopped pretending and just came out with it. You're not one of us. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining the wedding day. Emily in her pristine white dress, Mom crying happy tears, Dad beaming with pride, guests clapping, laughing, drinking champagne, and me, alone, uninvited, forgotten. My stomach turned. The betrayal morphed into something else, something darker, stronger. A fire started to burn in my chest. Not rage, but something sharper. Purpose. Resolve. If they thought they could cut me out and walk away without consequences, they didn't know me at all. I wasn't going to throw a tantrum. I wasn't going to post passive-aggressive comments online. I was going to remind them who I was, in a way they'd never forget. I was going to do it smart, quiet, and powerful. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the blank notepad in front of me. My pen hovered above the page, heart racing, as I began planning. Not revenge in the typical sense, but something more poetic. I didn't want to ruin her wedding. That would have been easy. I wanted to make a statement, something that would stop them in their tracks, shake the foundation of their perfect little world, and make them feel everything they made me feel: pain, guilt, reflection. I wasn't going to scream to be heard. I'd let the silence scream for me. I thought about all the people who'd ever been cast aside. The daughters told they weren't good enough. The sisters called too much. The women made to feel like outcasts in their own families. I was one of them now, and I wasn't going to let that identity bury me. I was going to rise from it, rebuild myself from the ashes of their rejection, and turn it into the loudest, most unforgettable declaration of my worth. It was no longer about getting even. It was about getting justice, not just for me, but for every broken voice that's ever been silenced in the name of keeping the peace. I wasn't a problem. I was the truth they didn't want to face, and I was done apologizing for it. So I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down at my laptop, and started crafting the plan that would stop the wedding in its tracks. Not with chaos, but with clarity, with elegance, with purpose. They wanted me to disappear. I'd make sure my absence was louder than any toast they could raise. I was done playing small, done trying to fit into a family mold that was never shaped for me. If they didn't want to see me at the wedding, then I'd make sure they felt me in every second of it. The crushing rejection they gave me would become the catalyst for the most powerful thing I'd ever done. And they wouldn't see it coming, not until it was too late. The morning after my decision, I stood by my apartment window, watching the world carry on outside, while my own world felt like it had cracked open. I didn't want drama. I didn't want to storm into the wedding in a red dress, or scream during the vows like some unhinged movie scene. I wanted something deeper, something that would land like a punch to the soul, not the face. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done, feel the ache of exclusion, feel the sting of a bond torn apart. And I wanted it delivered without me having to be anywhere near them. That's when the idea truly began to form. Not as a flash, but as a slow-burning ember that grew hotter with every breath I took. It had to be symbolic, artistic, powerful. Not just a stunt, but a message, a story in itself. I poured myself another cup of coffee, my hands still trembling slightly, and opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I didn't know exactly what I was searching for at first, just that I needed someone who understood emotion through creation, someone who could turn pain into art. After a few hours of scrolling and digging through artist directories and local galleries, I found her, Aria Lennox, a local artist whose work I'd seen in a downtown exhibition once, years ago. Her sculptures weren't just art. They were stories, frozen in glass and metal. Her most famous piece had gone viral for depicting a cracked birdcage, held together by human hands, symbolizing freedom and captivity in the same breath. I remembered standing in front of that piece back then, stunned, unable to move. I emailed her that same day. To my surprise, Aria responded within the hour. Her reply was short, but not cold. She said she didn't usually take private commissions, but there was something in my words, something she called raw truth, that made her curious. She agreed to meet. That weekend, I went to her studio. It was hidden in the back of an old brick warehouse, tucked away behind ivy-covered walls and a rusted steel door. Inside, it smelled of earth, dust, and something like burnt amber. There were half-finished statues everywhere, frozen bodies, cracked mirrors, broken clocks, all with stories etched into them. I sat on a stool while she circled me, like she was trying to read the pain right off my skin. "I need something that speaks," I told her, but without saying a word, she tilted her head, thinking, "Tell me what you want it to say." I hesitated. Then it all spilled out. The rejection, the disbelief, the ache in my chest that hadn't stopped throbbing since that phone call. I told her about Emily, about my parents, about how I didn't want revenge that screamed. I wanted one that whispered, and still haunted them. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I have an idea," she said. "A heart, glass, cracked but not shattered, bound together with golden wire. A metaphor for love that's been broken but refuses to disappear." I didn't realize I was crying until she handed me a cloth. It was perfect, a symbol of the pain they caused, and my strength for surviving it. Over the next week, I received updates from Aria. She sent me photos, close-ups of the cracks, the way the gold thread wrapped through the glass like veins, holding it all together. "It's almost done," she said. "It's delicate, but unbreakable. Like you." The sculpture was breathtaking, sharp and soft all at once. It looked like a heart that had been dropped and stepped on, but someone had taken the time to pick up every piece, mend it, and give it new life. I couldn't stop staring at it. It was everything I felt, everything they refused to see. But the sculpture wasn't enough. I needed words to carry its meaning. Not a dramatic manifesto, not a venomous letter, just honesty. So I sat down at my desk and wrote a letter. I rewrote it 9 times before I got it right. I wanted it to be truthful, not bitter, poetic, not pitiful. I wrote about what it felt like to be rejected by your own blood, what it meant to be erased from a moment that should have celebrated togetherness. I wrote about how their decision had wounded me, but also how I'd chosen not to let that wound define me. I told them the sculpture was a symbol, a heart broken, but mended, not as a gift of forgiveness, but as a reminder that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, and they didn't show up for me, not even when it mattered most. I ended the letter with a single line that I wanted to echo in their minds long after the wedding ended. "You may not have wanted me there, but now I'll be impossible to forget." When the package was ready, I had it delivered directly to the venue. I didn't want it handed to them beforehand, or tucked away like a forgotten box. I arranged for it to arrive at the precise moment the ceremony was set to begin. I paid extra for white glove service, made sure the courier was dressed in formal attire, and had the box wrapped in soft ivory paper with a deep red ribbon, the exact color Emily once said she hated. A final subtle twist of the knife. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my apartment again. But this time, there were no tears, no shaking hands, just silence and steel. I imagined the moment, guests in their seats, Emily gliding down the aisle, the air thick with sweet music and saccharine joy. Then the box arriving, quiet and unassuming, but drawing every eye like a storm on the horizon. I could already hear the murmurs, see the way Emily's face would tighten, how my parents would shift uncomfortably. And then someone would open it. They'd see the heart, fractured, beautiful, unbreakable, and the letter, my voice, even in absence. Maybe it wouldn't destroy the day. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to pierce it, to freeze them for a moment, to make them confront the ghost they tried to bury, to look at that sculpture and realize they had made that heartbreak and they couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. That was the revenge, not a scene, not a scandal, but a memory that would haunt every photo from that day, a crack in the fairy tale, a silent scream, forever frozen in time. As I stared out at the city lights that night, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Not complete, but enough to breathe again. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need an invitation. I just needed to reclaim my story. And now, I had. Not with a bang, but with art, with truth, and with a heart too strong to stay broken. The wedding day came with clear skies and golden sunbeams, as if the universe itself had decided to bless Emily's big day. Birds chirped overhead. The florist delivered breathtaking arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, and every detail, from the champagne glasses to the ivory aisle runner, reflected that glossy image of perfection my family clung to so tightly. But beneath that carefully polished surface, something raw and unpredictable was about to stir. While guests arrived, dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, and the pianist filled the air with delicate notes of Vivaldi, I sat miles away in my small apartment, sipping coffee in silence. I wasn't watching the clock. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what time the ceremony was set to begin. I could feel it in my bones. While Emily was likely being fluffed and fussed over by bridesmaids and photographers, preparing to float down the aisle like the princess she always imagined herself to be, something else was happening at the venue. My gift, simple on the outside, but devastating in meaning, had arrived, as planned, at the front doors of the church, carried in by a sharply dressed courier who asked for the wedding planner by name. It was received with polite confusion at first. No one expected an unlisted delivery. Not today. Not during the most curated event of the year. But curiosity spread, like a ripple through water. Who sent it? Why now? The weight of the box was unusual. Solid, heavy with intent. Its wrapping was elegant, intentional. Nothing about it screamed drama. Yet something about it whispered a warning. The wedding planner, a sleek woman in black, with a headset and clipboard, hesitated for only a moment before bringing it to the front of the chapel. My name wasn't signed on the outside, but there was no mistaking where it came from. My mother knew. I could almost hear her sharp intake of breath. Emily's eyes must have darted toward the object, confusion flickering in her perfectly made-up expression. She had no idea what it contained. But my parents, they did. Their nervous glances, the way they whispered urgently to each other, It was the unraveling I had hoped for. But it didn't stop there. The officiant was handed the envelope that rested atop the box. My letter, my voice, my presence, materialized in words and glass, impossible to ignore. The guests began settling into their seats, fanning themselves gently, unaware of the emotional landmine about to be triggered. Then, just as Emily stood ready behind the chapel doors, waiting for her cue, the box was opened. A stunned silence fell over the room like a sudden storm cloud. The chatter died mid-sentence. Laughter evaporated, and even the violinist's fingers froze on the strings. In the center of the satin-lined box was the sculpture, a heart, shattered yet somehow whole. Its cracks filled with shimmering gold threads that caught the light and fractured it across the walls. It wasn't just a piece of art. It was a confrontation. A mirror held up to every smiling face in that chapel. My letter was removed from its envelope, and although there were frantic whispers and attempts to delay, the officiant, confused and caught in the middle, decided to read it aloud. Because it was addressed not just to Emily or my parents, it was addressed to the entire family. To every person who had sat by, silently, pretending they didn't see the divide growing wider by the year. And now, they were going to hear what silence had buried. "You say I'm not good enough," the letter began, the words slicing through the air like knives disguised in lace. But family isn't about perfection. It's about forgiveness, understanding, and love. No matter how broken. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared forward, wide-eyed, mouths slightly parted. The room had become a vacuum. No sound, no movement, just the steady cadence of the officiant's voice, carrying my message through every pew. "This heart is ours," it continued. "Shattered, yes, but held together by something stronger than resentment." I imagine the way Emily's smile must have cracked, how the blush on her cheeks turned ghostly, pale. She'd spent months crafting an image of flawless celebration, but now, the one person she had tried so hard to erase had taken center stage, without even being there. My parents, I knew, wouldn't handle it gracefully. My father likely clenched his jaw, staring at the floor as if it could offer him an escape route. My mother probably glanced around, praying someone would stand up and shout that this was inappropriate, cruel, ill-timed. But no one did, because deep down, everyone recognized what they were witnessing wasn't malice. It was truth, raw, vulnerable, and unfiltered. And it hit harder than any outburst ever could. The tension in the room wasn't just discomfort, it was realization. Guilt hung heavy in the air. Emily's carefully curated fairy tale had been punctured, not by drama, but by honesty, and that made it impossible to dismiss. People began whispering, not in disapproval, but in confusion. Why wasn't Cassie invited? What happened between the sisters? Why does no one ever talk about her? The questions I had asked myself for years were finally being asked by others, and my parents couldn't hide from them anymore. The sculpture remained at the altar for the rest of the ceremony, a gleaming, fractured heart that stood taller than any flower arrangement or designer centerpiece. It stole the focus, it stole the silence, it stole the moment meant to erase me, and turned it into one where I was finally, undeniably, when the ceremony resumed. It did so with a strange stiffness. The laughter didn't return. The smiles were tighter. Emily walked down the aisle eventually, but she didn't float. She moved like someone who had just been struck by a truth too large to shake off. She said her vows, but her voice trembled. My parents applauded, but their eyes were distant. They were haunted now, not by me, but by the choice they made to exile me. That choice had come back in gold-filled cracks and fragile glass. It had come back dressed in elegance, armed with words that left bruises where no hand had been raised. And it would linger in every frame of the wedding album. Every time someone asked, "What's the story behind that heart?" I stayed home that night, ordered Thai food, lit a candle, and played my favorite records. Not out of celebration, but closure. I hadn't ruined Emily's day. I had reclaimed my place in it, on my own terms, in my own voice, without begging for a seat at a table that had never truly welcomed me. They had tried to silence me, erase me, forget me, but in the end, my absence had spoken louder than any speech. My silence had become a storm, and my heart, broken, repaired, real, was the loudest thing in the room. The hours after the ceremony were a blur of champagne toasts, awkward small talk, and 100 unspoken questions. I wasn't there, but I could still feel the ripple effect traveling through every corner of that event, like a silent earthquake. 1,000 decisions had built up to that day, and one sculpture, one letter, had cracked the foundation. I imagined the looks exchanged over champagne flutes, the way some guests avoided eye contact with my parents, while others leaned in to whisper with furrowed brows and cautious curiosity. I wasn't there to see it, but I knew. I could feel the discomfort threading through the room like invisible smoke. And at the heart of it all sat that fragile glass heart, untouched, unmoved, still reflecting light in a way none of them could ignore. They went through the motions. Emily cut the cake with trembling hands. My father forced a smile through clenched teeth, and my mother clutched her pearls like they were the last thing tethering her to normalcy. But it wasn't normal anymore. The illusion had shattered. The perfection had been exposed as performative, and for the first time, they had to sit in that truth, because there was no more pretending. My message had landed, not like a missile, but like a mirror. They saw themselves, saw each other, and they saw me, really saw me, for the first time in years. And that realization was its own kind of reckoning. Emily whispered my name. That detail made its way to me later, passed through hesitant lips and guilty text messages. She didn't say it with anger or sarcasm. She said it like a question, a memory, a regret. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. And honestly, that was more than I ever expected. I didn't check social media that day. I didn't stalk the wedding hashtags or scroll through filtered photos of smiling guests and floral arrangements. I didn't need to. My impact wasn't in the pictures. It was in the pause, in the breath everyone took when the sculpture was revealed, in the silence that fell when my letter was read. That's where I lived, right in that ache. The next day came quietly. I expected the backlash. A nasty call from my mother, a rant from Emily, cold silence from the rest of them. But none of that came, at least not right away. Instead, there was nothing, just a strange, uncertain stillness, as if no one quite knew how to respond. Days passed, then a week. I started to believe maybe they'd double down, bury it, pretend it never happened. But then, slowly, like ice beginning to thaw, something unexpected happened. A text came in from my cousin Tara, who I hadn't heard from in over 2 years. It was short, just 4 words. I saw your letter. I stared at my phone for a full minute before replying with a cautious, "And?" Her response came instantly. It changed everything. Then another message came in, this time from my Uncle Jeff. He said he didn't agree with how things had been handled. He admitted he hadn't known the full story. He said my words had hit him hard, and that he wanted to talk sometime. A week later, my aunt, my mother's sister, called. She sounded nervous, like she thought I'd hang up, but she just said, "Cassie, I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you." Her voice cracked halfway through. And mine did too. I didn't forgive her right away, but I listened, and that was the beginning. Emily didn't reach out. Not then, but I knew she was thinking, turning things over in her mind, maybe for the first time. She was proud, stubborn, just like me. I didn't expect a phone call or a tearful reunion, but I knew my silence was now filled with presence. I had taken up space in her story, whether she liked it or not, and I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the unexpected protagonist, the one she tried to cut out, but who still shaped the entire ending. My parents, that was the hardest part. There were no apologies, no sudden change of heart, but my dad forwarded me an article about an artist's exhibit in New York, a random, quiet attempt at connection. And my mom texted me a single sentence. "I didn't know it hurt you that much." It wasn't enough. Not nearly. But it wasn't nothing. It was the first crack in their wall. And I'd take that over silence any day. The funny thing is, people assume revenge always has to be cruel, that it has to tear something down, burn it all to the ground. But sometimes, the deepest revenge is just truth. Unapologetic, undiluted truth, delivered with enough elegance that no one can call it rage. That's what my gift was. Not a weapon, but a wake-up call. Not destruction, but clarity. They saw me, not as a mess or a rebel, or the sister who never measured up, but as someone they had failed to understand. Someone who had survived their silence, their judgment, and still found a way to speak. I began to feel lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally been heard. And there's a power in that, a quiet, relentless kind of healing. I started reconnecting with parts of myself I had buried to keep the peace. I painted again. I took long walks. I stopped rehearsing fake conversations in my head. I no longer cared what they said behind closed doors, because I had forced them to open those doors, even if just a crack. And through all of it, the sculpture remained with them. I made sure it wasn't returned. I didn't want it back. That piece belonged in their home now, a permanent reminder of the daughter, the sister, the girl they tried to write off. Every time they passed it, dusted it, explained it to a confused visitor, they'd have to confront what they'd done. And maybe one day, when the silence between us had softened completely, they'd understand the full weight of it, not as a punishment, but as a mirror, a lesson in love, loyalty, and what it means to break something and still try to mend it. Looking back now, after everything, I sit with a strange kind of peace. Not because things were neatly resolved. Life rarely wraps itself in a bow. But because I chose to stand, when everything inside me wanted to shrink, disappear, beg for scraps of love, I chose defiance wrapped in grace. I chose to speak, even when they refused to listen. And no, I don't regret sending that gift. Not for a second. That sculpture wasn't just an object. It was my soul crystallized. It was my scream in silence, my refusal to be erased. It was the first time I made my pain visible in a way they couldn't unsee, couldn't dismiss, couldn't pretend wasn't real. And that, to me, was everything. Because revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes, revenge is being undeniable. Sometimes, revenge is rising so powerfully that those who tried to bury you are forced to remember why they feared your truth in the first place. I've come to understand that my story wasn't only about rejection. It was about reclamation, about taking back my narrative from the hands that twisted it. For so long, I thought I had to earn my place. I thought love meant shrinking, compromising, biting my tongue so I could be less difficult, less emotional, less me. But when they locked me out of that wedding, they did more than exclude me from a celebration. They confirmed the truth I'd been avoiding, that I had been living on the margins of my own family for years. And that realization hurt, but it also set me free. Because once you understand your worth doesn't hinge on anyone's approval, the entire game changes. You stop begging. You stop apologizing for taking up space. You stop folding yourself into a shape that makes others comfortable. I told my story, not just for me, but for anyone who's been dismissed, silenced, cast aside by the very people meant to love them most. If you've ever been told you're too much or not enough, I hope you hear this and let it seep into your bones. You are not the problem. Their inability to see your brilliance is not your burden to carry. You don't have to burn to keep anyone else warm. You don't need permission to exist. And you damn sure don't need to wait for a seat at the table if you can build your own. What I did wasn't about revenge in the bitter sense. It was about dignity, about carving my name into a moment they wanted me excluded from, about showing up without physically being there and still leaving the deepest mark. The aftermath didn't transform my family into saints. They didn't suddenly become warm, understanding, emotionally fluent people. But that was never the goal. The goal was clarity, and I got that. I saw who leaned in when it mattered, who broke their silence, who sent that first hesitant message. And just as importantly, I saw who didn't, who chose to stay quiet, to keep pretending, to cling to comfort over truth. And I learned to let go of expecting anything more. That's the final piece of this lesson. Healing isn't about fixing others. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of their approval. It's about reclaiming your voice, your value, your self-worth, and building a life where your presence isn't questioned. It's honored. There's something almost poetic about how everything played out. My sister still hasn't said the words, "I'm sorry," but I see her in my likes, in my views, quietly watching, trying to understand. And that's fine. Let her watch. Let them all witness what happens when a woman they dismissed rises without permission. I don't need them to clap. I don't need their flowers. I have my own. I water them with every brave choice I make now. Every time I speak when I used to stay silent. Every time I claim space I was told I didn't deserve. That's what victory looks like. Not applause, but peace. So, if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe curled up in your room, feeling invisible, like you don't matter, hear this from me to you. You do matter. You're not too broken. You're not too loud. You're not too different. The people who can't handle your truth were never your home. And sometimes it takes being pushed out to realize you were meant to build your own kingdom. Your voice, your pain, your story. It has power. Don't wait for someone else to recognize it. Declare it. Honor it. Show the world what happens when someone no one believed in refuses to stay small. To my family, if you ever hear this, I don't hate you. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. I won't minimize the nights I cried so hard. I thought I'd disappear. But I won't let that pain define me either. I am more than what you chose to see. I am more than the role you wrote for me. You lost me for a while. It's true. But I found myself. And I'm not going anywhere now. This heart, shattered, stitched together with golden threads, fierce in its fragility, is still beating, still here, still strong. And I will never let anyone make me question that again.